The next person I'd like to introduce to explain the Presidential Emergency Board, who did an outstanding job at the presenting to this board, and is the TCU Assistant President to the TCU, Joel Parker. Loyalty, trust, and concern for the riding public. 3 models that he has. And that's what he does every day. 35 years of presenting fair negotiations. And he has been positive to the riders, he has been positive to his members, and positive to the elected officials here today. So I thank you all for coming. I thank you for your support, and I look forward to your support right to the end so that we can keep this system moving from the city to the island to every metropolitan area. Joel Parker.
Thank you, Anthony. There's so many microphones here, I don't know where to put my remarks. I won't take long, and to your relief, I'll be the last speaker. And then we're going to open it up for questions, which I'm sure you have. I want to start by thanking Brother John Samuelsen for putting this together. And he personifies the union movement's time-honored value of solidarity. As Anthony said, the ties between New York Transit and commuter workers have never been stronger, and I am here to tell you they will endure. I also want to acknowledge and thank Anthony. Anthony's the head of our largest union, UTU SMART, on Long Island Railroad. He's our coalition's public spokesman, and as you can see, he's doing a tremendous job in voicing the aspirations of all our union members, whether they're in UTU or not, in this very difficult struggle. I do want to introduce the other people on the dais. Artie Maratia, who Anthony mentioned, he's my union's vice president, who from day one has worked with Anthony, as Anthony said, to try to bargain, to get MTA to bargain in good faith. We haven't been successful yet, but we'll get there. And our other coalition partner, Dean DeVita of the National Conference of Firemen and Oilers, SEIU. John Lacey, who's also in my union, the International Association of Machinists, and Charles Fraley of the Sheet Metal Workers SMART. I serve as, just to give you my background, I serve as the bargaining spokesman for our coalition in negotiations. And I was the chief union witness for all the unions at the Presidential Emergency Board. As my day job is I'm special assistant to the TCU-IAM National President, Bob Scartoletti, and a National Vice President. I'm involved in all our union's major negotiations, including the National Freight Contract, Amtrak, and every major commuter contract that we do. I've been elected as the spokesman and chief negotiator for multi-union coalitions on Amtrak, Metro North, and MBCR, as well as Long Island, MBCR being Boston Commuter. And while we usually, and it's always our goal, to reach voluntary agreements without the help of presidential emergency boards, where that hasn't worked, I've testified at PEB's presidential emergency boards on Amtrak, National Freight, recently, and Metro North. In every case, and I know this concept of a presidential emergency board is very foreign to anyone not in the Railway Labor Act world where we live, so I'm going to spend some time, because to understand where this dispute might go, you need to understand the role of presidential emergency boards in resolving these disputes. In every case I've been involved in, the unions and railroads have settled immediately on the basis of PEB recommendations. That is exactly what Congress intended when they enacted the Railway Labor Act, and then they amended it when it came to commuters with Section 9A, which provides for the second presidential emergency board. The goal that Congress had was to avoid the devastating economic impact of rail strikes by having a panel of neutral expert arbitrators recommend compromise terms for settlement. Often, one side or the other feels aggrieved by the results. In last round's Metro North Presidential Emergency Board, for example, the union's position, I was the spokesman, was essentially rejected almost entirely by the Presidential Emergency Board. They went against us on all but one issue. My union and every other union nevertheless settled on the basis of the first PEB's recommendations. In the last round, which was only 2 years ago, of national freight negotiations, that's with every national freight railroad in the United States, Norfolk Southern, CSX, Burlington Northern Santa Fe, Union Pacific, Kansas City Southern. that presidential emergency board had the same chairman and arbitrator members as this Long Island Presidential Emergency Board, the same three. The 10 rail union, we were in a coalition, brought to that PEB scores, and I mean scores, of what we thought were very valid work rule demands, proposals. Every single one of them was rejected by the Presidential Emergency Board, every single one. But nonetheless, every union accepted the recommendations of that Presidential Emergency Board rather than subject the country to a national rail strike. That's how it's supposed to work. That's how Congress designed it to work, until this time. For the first time in my 35-year union career, I have seen a rail carrier spit in the face of a Presidential Emergency Board's recommendations and publicly say, and they keep writing us and saying it in the press, that they will only resume bargaining if we agree, the unions, to go back to square one and pretend that the Presidential Emergency Board never existed. This is unprecedented and reckless behavior. And if it's allowed to continue, it will result in a shutdown of vital transportation to the great city of New York. In fact, as both John and Anthony said, until yesterday, the MTA wouldn't even say they'd avoid a strike in March, which they can do unilaterally, by invoking a second Presidential Emergency Board if no agreement was reached by then. And it took, as people said, the efforts of the New York Congressional delegation to back them down, and now they finally relented and agreed to stop holding the riders of Long Island Railroad and the workers of Long Island Railroad hostage. So what is the basis of MTA's intransigence? They say, again and again and again, it's to avert a fare increase. That phony smokescreen has been rejected by 4 consecutive transit arbitrators under the Taylor Act, starting with arbitrator Zuccotti's decision with Local 100 right here. And now again it's been rejected by a Presidential Emergency Board appointed by President Obama. The 3 arbitrators on that Presidential Emergency Board are 3 of the most experienced, well-respected neutrals in the arbitration world. All 3 served on the recent National Freight Presidential Emergency Board. The chairman, Ira Jaffe, had been appointed by President Bush to the last Amtrak Presidential Emergency Board. They are neither pro-labor nor pro-company. They fashioned a well-reasoned compromise after reviewing exhaustive testimony, a week-long of oral hearing and volumes of written testimony by both sides, presented by both sides. And they, after reviewing that, like every other neutral body before them, rejected outright MTA's divisive threat that the modest wage increases they recommended would trigger fare hikes. MTA's credibility, when they make this unfounded claim, is as spurious as their testimony under oath to the PEB and endlessly repeated to the press that they subjected management to years of salary freezes. That lie was thankfully exposed by the Daily News. Nor can anyone put stock in politically motivated cries of inability to pay when not long before the Presidential Emergency Board, it took the New York State Auditor to uncover $1.9 billion in revenue MTA didn't even know they had. And their inability to pay claim is further belied by their recent contract with MTA Police, which produces net annual wage increases almost identical to the Presidential Emergency Board recommendations for us. Of course, they also misrepresent that deal as somehow supporting their 3 net zero demand when it does nothing of the kind. It's well above 2% a year. It's actually 2.3% a year for the Long Island, the MTA Police. So let's get to what these recommendations are that, according to MTA, will break the bank. The PEB's recommendation of net annual wage increases of 2.5% can hardly be called extreme, especially when they're tied to employee health contributions at a higher percent of wage than anywhere else in the rail commuter industry. This was far from a victory for our members. The recommendations are below the last major commuter settlements we just made in Chicago and before that Boston, which are the 2 next largest commuter systems. But we are willing to accept them only because we know that we have to balance our members' legitimate rights to a decent standard of living they work at all hours and weather in extremely dangerous occupations with our responsibility to serve the public. So in conclusion, I thank you for being here, our elected officials, but I ask you to use the power, or to continue to use the power of your offices to persuade the MTA to change course and accept the PEB recommendations. Failure to do so will inevitably lead to a strike in July, a strike that we do not want, and that can be avoided if MTA would adhere to Congress's intent when they legislated presidential emergency boards as a way to avoid railroad strikes. Thank you. And now we're going to open it up for questions. I'm going to turn it back over to John.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Joel. Thank you, Anthony. I believe we've designed this as a legislative briefing, and I realize there's a lot of media here, but I would first like to take any questions from any legislators, if they have any, about this process, and in particular, how this process played out to its ugliest extreme will affect New York City. With that, yes?
Hi, I'm Karen from TWU Local.
Yes.
I have a question about what takes place now that basically it's on hold, and where is the process?
The National Mediation Board technically doesn't have jurisdiction anymore, but they have asked in the public interest for the parties to resume negotiations. When the Presidential Emergency Board was released, I personally immediately reached out to Anita Miller, who's the bargainer for MTA, and said, when are we going to resume negotiations? We want to resume on the basis of the PEB report. She said they were, frankly, in disarray at that point. They would get back to us. They never did. Finally, 2 weeks ago, we wrote again saying resume. They said they would only resume, they put this in writing, if we agreed to rip up the PEB and start over, which we would not do. At that point, the NMB stepped in, and they scheduled negotiations for next Thursday and Friday in Washington. We will be there. MTA is going to be there, so we're hopeful that there will be a change of course. Yesterday, for the first time, Chairman Prendergast acknowledged that if we don't reach an agreement between now and March 21st, which is the end of the cooling off period, they will then invoke a second presidential emergency board. That second presidential emergency board, that's an either or. Under the law, that board cannot fashion, they can't come up with another deal. Each side does their best offer, and they have to pick. And in the history of since 9A was enacted, the second board has never gone against the first board, ever. So, you know, this basically just stalls it out, unless they change their position. So, you know, we are hopeful that they're going to change their position and start bargaining on the basis. It's not like it has to be every word of that report, but we're not going to take less than the value of that report. We're going to move things around. But they have said they will never do that. So, you know, we hope that'll change. We hope you can put some pressure on them to make a change. But barring that, there'll be a second board report, and the end of that cooling off period, assuming we do not get to an agreement, is July. I think it is 19th, but it's mid-July, at which point that's it. And if there's no agreement, there will be a strike. And there is no other, you know, legal end to the strike. The only way the strike can end at that point is either by agreement. Under the Railway Labor Act, that's it. Congress could intervene. They had never had a commuter dispute except once. We're hoping it doesn't come to that.